What would it take for you to leave everything behind? Your home, your country, your family, your routines, your security, everything familiar to you. And not because of war, not because of disaster, not because you were forced to, but simply because a voice told you to go. No map, no certainty, no proof, just faith. Most people spend their entire lives trying to reduce uncertainty. They want stable income, stable relationships, stable plans, predictable futures. Human beings crave control because uncertainty creates anxiety. The unknown terrifies the human mind. Yet the story of Abraham begins with something deeply uncomfortable. A man asked to walk directly into uncertainty. Abraham was not born a king, not a warrior, not a prophet standing on a mountain surrounded by miracles. He was an ordinary man, living an ordinary life. And then one command changed everything. Leave your country, your people, and your father's household, and go to the land I will show you. Notice something important. God does not immediately explain everything. There is no detailed roadmap, no guarantees about how difficult the journey will become. Abraham is simply told, leave, and somehow, unbelievably, he does. Perhaps that is why Abraham remains one of the most psychologically fascinating figures in human history, because his story forces humanity to confront one of its deepest fears, the fear of the unknown. Human beings naturally cling to familiarity. Familiar places feel safe. Familiar people feel safe. Familiar routines create emotional stability. Even unhappy lives can become comfortable simply because they are predictable. Many people remain trapped for years inside situations that slowly destroy them. Toxic relationships, meaningless careers, empty routines, emotional numbness. Why? Because uncertainty often feels more frightening than suffering. At least familiar pain feels controllable. Abraham walks away from that illusion completely. He steps into a future he cannot fully see. And perhaps modern humanity struggles with this more than ever before. Anxiety disorders continue rising globally. People obsess over planning every detail of life. Fear failure. Fear instability. Fear losing control. Entire industries now profit from human insecurity about the future. Yet reality remains unpredictable, no matter how advanced civilization becomes. Careers collapse. Economies shift. Relationships end. Health changes. Life refuses to offer absolute certainty. Abraham's story begins where human control ends. And that is exactly why it feels so terrifying. Because faith is easy when outcomes are visible. Faith becomes psychologically difficult when nothing is guaranteed. Abraham leaves behind comfort without knowing where the journey will lead. And perhaps this raises a disturbing philosophical question. Is faith true courage or dangerous irrationality? Throughout history, humanity has admired people willing to risk everything for something invisible. Explorers, revolutionaries, inventors, spiritual leaders, immigrants, leaving home for uncertain futures. Every meaningful transformation begins with uncertainty. Yet uncertainty also creates fear powerful enough to paralyze people completely. Abraham represents the human being willing to move forward despite not fully understanding what lies ahead. And perhaps that is why his story still matters thousands of years later. Because modern people still face the same internal battle every day. The battle between comfort and growth, between control and trust, between safety and meaning. Maybe the most difficult journeys in life are not physical journeys at all. Maybe they are the moments when human beings must leave behind the familiar version of themselves before they can become something greater. And perhaps the most unsettling part of Abraham's story is this. Deep down, every human being knows there are moments in life where certainty disappears and only faith remains. Abraham's journey begins with a command that sounds almost simple at first. Leave your country, your people, and your father's household. But psychologically, this command is enormous. Because God was not merely asking Abraham to change locations. He was asking him to abandon the entire structure of certainty that shaped his identity. Human beings are deeply attached to familiarity. Familiar places create emotional safety. Familiar people create belonging. Familiar routines create psychological stability. Most people do not realize how much of their identity depends on environment until they are forced to leave it behind. Abraham is asked to leave his homeland, his culture, his social status, his tribe, his inherited identity, and walk toward a future he cannot fully see. Imagine the emotional weight of that decision. No detailed map, no certainty, no visible proof that the journey will succeed, only a promise. And perhaps this is where Abraham's story becomes deeply modern. Because many people today secretly feel trapped between comfort and meaning. They remain inside lives that no longer feel alive because familiarity feels safer than uncertainty. A career they hate, a relationship draining their soul, a routine slowly numbing them emotionally. Why do people stay? Because uncertainty terrifies the human mind. Human beings naturally prefer predictable discomfort over unpredictable change. At least familiar suffering feels controllable. Abraham chooses the opposite path. He walks away from stability before knowing exactly what waits ahead. And perhaps that is one of the hardest things a human being can ever do. Leave behind an old identity before a new identity fully exists. Most transformations begin in uncertainty. Yet uncertainty creates anxiety because it destroys the illusion of control. Modern psychology understands this deeply. The human brain constantly seeks predictability, patterns, stability, clear outcomes. Uncertainty activates fear because the unknown feels dangerous biologically. Throughout evolution, unpredictability often meant survival risk, which means Abraham's journey is not only spiritual, it is psychologically unnatural. He willingly steps into instability, and perhaps this is why so many people never pursue meaningful change. Not because they lack dreams, but because they fear uncertainty more than unhappiness. There is a painful truth hidden here. Comfort zones often become invisible prisons. People slowly trade aliveness for predictability. They stop taking risks, stop growing, stop questioning, stop pursuing meaning, because safety becomes more important than transformation. Abraham's story challenges that instinct completely. His journey begins not with clarity, but with surrender. He must move before fully understanding. This pattern appears repeatedly throughout human life. Entrepreneurs leave stable careers to pursue uncertain visions. Immigrants leave countries seeking futures they cannot guarantee. Artists risk failure to create something meaningful. Individuals leave toxic environments without knowing whether healing will come afterward. Every meaningful reinvention requires walking through uncertainty first. Yet society often celebrates transformation only after success becomes visible. People admire courage in hindsight, but during the process itself, uncertainty feels terrifying. Abraham likely looked irrational to many people around him. Why abandon stability for an invisible promise? Why risk everything for something unproven? Human beings naturally distrust paths without guarantees, which raises another important psychological truth. People often confuse familiarity with safety, but familiar situations are not always healthy. Some environments slowly destroy the soul while appearing externally stable. Abraham's homeland may have provided predictability, but his calling required growth beyond predictability. And perhaps growth itself always demands some form of departure, because people cannot become new versions of themselves while clinging entirely to old identities. Another powerful aspect of Abraham leaving home is separation from collective identity. Ancient societies were built around tribe and family structure. Leaving your father's household meant leaving the deepest source of social belonging. Human beings fear social separation intensely. Belonging shapes emotional security, which means Abraham's journey was not merely geographical. It was existential. He was leaving behind the social structure defining who he was. Modern people experience similar struggles constantly. Someone changes beliefs and loses community. Someone leaves a toxic family system and feels guilt. Someone outgrows old friendships and experiences loneliness. Someone reinvents life entirely and no longer recognizes the person they once were. Transformation often creates isolation before it creates clarity. Abraham walks directly into that isolation. Another difficult truth emerges here. Meaningful journeys often begin before emotional readiness exists. Human beings usually wait to feel confident before acting. But life rarely works that way. Courage often appears after movement begins, not before. Abraham does not receive total certainty before leaving. He leaves first. This is psychologically important because modern culture often glorifies complete preparation. People want perfect plans, perfect timing, perfect confidence. But waiting for complete certainty can become another form of fear. Some individuals spend years preparing emotionally for lives they never actually begin living. Abraham's story suggests movement itself creates transformation. Identity changes through the journey, not before it. Another fascinating psychological aspect of Abraham's departure is the tension between control and trust. Human beings deeply crave control because control reduces anxiety. Planning creates temporary emotional comfort. Yet reality constantly disrupts human plans. Illness, loss, economic collapse, betrayal, unexpected opportunities. Life remains fundamentally unpredictable despite all attempts to control it. Abraham's journey forces confrontation with this reality. He cannot control the outcome fully. He can only choose whether to trust enough to continue walking forward. And perhaps this explains why faith becomes so psychologically difficult for modern people. Contemporary society worships certainty, data, metrics, forecasts, calculations. Yet some of the most important human experiences can never be fully guaranteed. Love, purpose, meaning, trust, transformation. Every meaningful commitment contains uncertainty. Abraham becomes symbolic of the human willingness to move forward without possessing total control. Another important theme hidden in Abraham leaving home is sacrifice. Every major transformation requires losing something. Old comfort, old identity, old routines, old security. Human beings often desire growth without sacrifice, but real transformation usually costs something emotionally. Abraham sacrifices predictability itself, and perhaps that sacrifice reflects one of the deepest truths about human development. People cannot discover new possibilities while refusing to release old attachments. This is why so many individuals remain emotionally stuck. They want change without uncertainty, meaning without risk, growth without discomfort. But Abraham's story suggests those things rarely coexist. Another emotionally powerful detail is Abraham's age. He is not a young man beginning life. He leaves during a later stage of existence when most people seek stability rather than reinvention. This matters deeply because many individuals believe transformation belongs only to youth. But Abraham's story challenges that assumption. Human beings remain capable of reinvention far longer than fear often allows them to believe. Yet reinvention becomes harder psychologically with age, because attachment to familiarity grows stronger over time. Abraham still chooses movement instead of stagnation. And perhaps that is why his story resonates across generations. Because every human being eventually faces moments requiring departure. Departure from fear, departure from old identities, departure from limiting environments, departure from false security. Some people answer that call. Others spend entire lives avoiding it. Abraham becomes symbolic of the rare individual willing to walk into uncertainty because remaining unchanged feels spiritually impossible. Yet perhaps the most profound aspect of his departure is this: Abraham does not know the entire destination. He only knows the next step. And maybe that reflects one of the deepest realities of human existence. People rarely receive complete understanding before beginning meaningful journeys. Life unfolds gradually. Faith unfolds gradually. Identity unfolds gradually. Human beings often demand certainty about the entire future before taking action. But perhaps transformation only becomes visible while walking forward. Abraham leaves home not because fear disappears, but because something greater than fear begins guiding him. And maybe that is the beginning of every meaningful human journey. The moment purpose becomes stronger than the desire to remain safe. Abraham had left his home, left certainty, left familiarity. But perhaps the hardest part of his journey was only beginning. Because leaving once is difficult. Waiting afterward without visible results is even harder. God had promised Abraham something extraordinary. Descendants as numerous as the stars, a future, a covenant, a legacy beyond imagination. But there was one overwhelming problem. Abraham was old, and Sarah, his wife, was barren. Reality itself appeared to contradict the promise completely. And perhaps this is where Abraham's story becomes painfully human. Because faith feels inspiring when outcomes seem possible. Faith becomes psychologically terrifying when visible reality points in the opposite direction. Human beings naturally trust what they can see. Evidence creates emotional security. Logic creates stability. Predictability reduces fear. But Abraham is asked to continue believing while the evidence surrounding him suggests impossibility. Imagine the psychological tension of that existence. Year after year passes. Time moves forward. Bodies age. Hope grows fragile. The promise remains invisible. And still, Abraham waits. Modern people often underestimate how emotionally exhausting waiting can become, especially waiting without certainty. Waiting tests identity itself, because prolonged uncertainty slowly exposes what human beings truly trust. Many people begin journeys enthusiastically when hope feels immediate, but delayed fulfillment changes everything psychologically. Dreams become harder to protect over time. Doubt grows quietly. Fear grows quietly. Exhaustion grows quietly. Abraham likely wrestled internally with impossible questions. What if I misunderstood? What if this promise will never happen? What if I sacrificed everything for nothing? These are deeply human fears. And perhaps modern, humanity experiences them constantly. People work toward goals without visible progress. Build careers that take years to succeed. Pursue healing that feels painfully slow. Wait for relationships. Wait for purpose. Wait for change. Human beings struggle deeply with delayed results because the modern world conditions people to expect immediacy, instant entertainment, instant communication, instant gratification. Yet the most meaningful transformations in life usually unfold slowly. Character develops slowly. Trust develops slowly. Wisdom develops slowly. Healing develops slowly. Abraham's story exists in direct opposition to modern impatience. He continues walking through uncertainty without immediate proof. And perhaps that is one reason his story feels psychologically overwhelming. Because most people desperately want reassurance before continuing forward. Abraham often receives silence instead. Another fascinating aspect of Abraham's faith is that doubt itself never fully disappears. Religious storytelling is often misunderstood as portraying perfect certainty, but Abraham repeatedly struggles emotionally throughout his journey. He questions, hesitates, fears, attempts to control outcomes himself. At one point, Abraham and Sarah become so overwhelmed by waiting that they attempt to fulfill the promise through human strategy rather than patience. They create solutions driven by anxiety. And perhaps that reflects another timeless human tendency. When uncertainty becomes unbearable, people often try forcing outcomes prematurely. Why? Because uncertainty creates psychological discomfort. The unknown feels emotionally unsafe. Modern society constantly experiences this. People rush relationships because loneliness feels unbearable. Rush careers because they fear falling behind. Rush identity formation because ambiguity creates anxiety. Human beings often choose premature certainty over patient trust. Abraham's journey repeatedly confronts this temptation. Another important psychological truth emerges here. Faith and doubt are not opposites. They often exist together. Many people imagine faith means never questioning, never struggling, never fearing. But Abraham's story suggests something far more realistic. Faith may not mean the absence of doubt. It may mean continuing forward despite doubt. This changes everything psychologically, because uncertainty is unavoidable in human existence. Nobody fully knows whether relationships will last, whether dreams will succeed, whether sacrifices will matter, whether the future will unfold as hoped. Human beings constantly live without complete evidence, yet they continue making commitments anyway. Love itself requires uncertainty. Marriage requires uncertainty. Parenthood requires uncertainty. Purpose requires uncertainty. Abraham becomes symbolic of the human willingness to continue moving without possessing total clarity. Another painful tension in Abraham's story is the conflict between visible reality and invisible promise. Every day, his body aged further. Every year, Sarah remained unable to conceive. Reality appeared to mock hope directly. And perhaps this reflects one of the deepest struggles in human psychology. People trust visible evidence more easily than invisible possibility. Modern culture especially worships measurable outcomes, numbers, data, immediate results. But many of the most important aspects of life cannot be measured instantly. Emotional healing, spiritual growth, long-term purpose, character formation. Human beings often abandon meaningful journeys simply because progress remains invisible temporarily. Abraham's story challenges this instinct radically. He continues trusting despite contradiction. And perhaps that is why his journey feels simultaneously inspiring and frightening. Because faith without evidence always appears irrational from the outside. Imagine how Abraham must have looked to others. An aging man still, believing impossible promises. Human beings often mock unseen conviction because certainty without proof makes people uncomfortable. Society generally rewards visible success, not invisible perseverance. Yet history repeatedly shows that many transformative individuals acted before evidence fully existed. Explorers crossed oceans before maps were complete. Scientists pursued theories before proof arrived. Visionaries imagined futures others considered impossible. Every breakthrough begins as invisible possibility before becoming visible reality. Another profound psychological aspect of Abraham's faith is endurance through ambiguity. Human beings crave closure, clear answers, definite timelines, predictable outcomes. But life rarely provides those things consistently. Abraham lives for years inside unresolved tension, promise without fulfillment, hope without certainty, direction without complete understanding. This is emotionally exhausting, and perhaps many modern people experience the same invisible exhaustion today. People continue working while secretly questioning whether their efforts matter. Continue loving while fearing loss. Continue searching for meaning while battling internal uncertainty. Modern anxiety often emerges from humanity's desperate need for control inside an uncontrollable reality. Abraham's story confronts that fear directly. Another important detail is that Abraham's faith changes him psychologically over time. Waiting reshapes identity. Suffering reshapes identity. Uncertainty reshapes identity. Human beings do not pass through prolonged waiting unchanged. Some become bitter, cynical, emotionally numb. Others become deeper, more patient, more resilient. Abraham's journey slowly transforms him internally. Faith becomes less about immediate reward and more about trust itself. And perhaps that reflects a profound truth about maturity. Mature human beings eventually accept that life cannot be fully controlled. Certainty remains incomplete. Outcomes remain fragile. Yet meaningful living still requires commitment despite uncertainty. Another fascinating tension in Abraham's story is the relationship between faith and logic. Modern culture often frames them as enemies, but Abraham's story presents something more complex. Logic alone would tell Abraham the promise was impossible, yet pure emotion alone would collapse under fear. Abraham exists in the painful space between rational limitation and transcendent possibility. This is why philosophers like Soren Kierkegaard later became fascinated with Abraham. Kierkegaard described faith as the leap, not irrational madness, but the willingness to move beyond complete certainty while still carrying doubt. Human beings often reach moments where logic alone cannot fully guide them. Love requires leaps. Meaning requires leaps. Creativity requires leaps. Hope itself requires leaps. Without some form of faith, people become trapped inside paralysis. Another powerful aspect of Abraham's journey is the silence between promises. God speaks, then long stretches of waiting follow. Human beings often struggle most, not with dramatic suffering, but with silence. Silence creates room for insecurity, fear, doubt, overthinking. Abraham likely experienced all of these emotions repeatedly. Yet he continues moving, and perhaps that is the real psychological core of faith. Movement without total certainty, not blindness, not emotional denial, but perseverance, despite incomplete understanding. Another uncomfortable truth hidden in Abraham's story is this. Modern people often demand guarantees before commitment. Guaranteed success, guaranteed happiness, guaranteed outcomes. But life rarely offers guarantees, which means meaningful existence always requires some degree of faith. Even atheists place faith somewhere. In progress, in reason, in human potential, in science, in personal identity. Human beings cannot live without trusting something beyond immediate proof. Abraham simply becomes one of the clearest symbols of that condition. A man walking through uncertainty guided by invisible meaning. And perhaps that is why his story still resonates across thousands of years. Because modern humanity still fears the same thing Abraham faced. The terrifying possibility that life's most important journeys may require moving forward before certainty arrives. Why does uncertainty terrify human beings so deeply? Why do people desperately try to predict the future, control outcomes, and eliminate risk, even when life repeatedly proves itself unpredictable? These questions sit at the center of Abraham's story. Because Abraham was not simply asked to believe in God. He was asked to walk into uncertainty without guarantees. And psychologically, that may be one of the hardest things any human being can do. Human beings crave certainty because certainty creates the illusion of safety. Predictability calms the nervous system. Familiar routines reduce anxiety. Stable patterns make reality feel manageable. Throughout human evolution, uncertainty often meant danger. Unknown environments could contain predators, scarcity, death, which means fear of uncertainty is deeply biological. The human brain constantly tries to predict what happens next because prediction increases survival. This is why unexpected change feels emotionally destabilizing. Sudden illness, job loss, betrayal, economic collapse, rejection. Human beings suffer not only because painful events happen, but because uncertainty destroys the illusion of control surrounding life itself. Abraham's journey attacks that illusion directly. He leaves home without complete clarity, walks toward promises without visible evidence, waits for outcomes beyond his ability to control. And perhaps this is why his story feels so psychologically intense, because modern humanity still fights the same fear every day. People obsess over planning because unpredictability creates anxiety. Entire industries exist to reduce uncertainty. Insurance, forecasting, financial systems, career structures, productivity culture. Human beings constantly attempt to make life controllable, yet reality repeatedly reminds humanity that complete control is impossible. And perhaps that realization itself creates existential fear, because uncertainty forces confrontation with human limitation. People realize they cannot fully control the future, relationships, health. No. Ray, as death, or even their own emotions completely. Abraham becomes symbolic of the human being forced to live without the comfort of total certainty. Another reason humans fear uncertainty is because identity itself often depends on stability. Familiar environments reinforce who people believe they are. Jobs create identity. Relationships create identity. Social roles create identity. Routine creates psychological structure. Uncertainty threatens all of these things simultaneously. This is why major life transitions feel emotionally overwhelming. Immigration, divorce, career change, financial instability, loss, invention. Human beings are not merely losing circumstances during these moments. They are losing familiar versions of themselves. Abraham experiences exactly this. Leaving home meant leaving the structure that defined his life. He enters a space where identity itself becomes unstable. And perhaps modern people understand this more deeply than they realize. Many individuals secretly remain trapped in unfulfilling lives because uncertainty feels more frightening than dissatisfaction. A toxic relationship may feel painful, but at least it feels familiar. A meaningless career may feel empty, but at least it feels predictable. Human beings often choose familiar suffering over uncertain freedom. This is one of the great paradoxes of human psychology. People crave growth, but fear the uncertainty growth requires. Abraham's story exposes that contradiction directly. Another profound reason uncertainty creates fear is because it exposes mortality. Human beings distract themselves constantly from existential awareness. Entertainment, achievement, consumption, productivity, noise. Yet uncertainty reminds people how fragile existence truly is. The future cannot be guaranteed. Life cannot be fully controlled. Death remains unavoidable, which means uncertainty forces humanity into confrontation with vulnerability itself. Modern culture often responds by intensifying the illusion of control. Over-planning, hyper-productivity, constant optimization, endless preparation. Yet beneath much of this behavior lies anxiety, the desperate hope that enough planning might finally eliminate fear. But life refuses to become completely predictable. Abraham learns to continue walking despite this reality. Another psychological reason humans fear uncertainty is because ambiguity creates mental exhaustion. The brain constantly searches for closure, definite answers, clear outcomes. Humans feel calmer when situations appear resolved. Uncertainty leaves the mind suspended. Overthinking begins. Fear expands. catastrophic imagination appears. Abraham likely experienced this repeatedly during his journey. Years pass without visible fulfillment. Silence stretches across time. Doubt inevitably enters the mind. Modern anxiety disorders often function similarly. Human beings struggle profoundly with unresolved ambiguity. Will this relationship survive? Will I succeed? Will things improve? Am I wasting my life? The mind attempts to solve uncertainty constantly because unresolved tension feels psychologically painful. Yet, Abraham continues living inside unresolved tension for decades. And perhaps this is one reason his story still feels extraordinary. Because most people desperately seek escape from ambiguity. Another important reason uncertainty frightens people is social pressure. Society rewards predictability, stable careers, stable income, clear plans, conventional paths. People stepping into uncertainty often appear irrational to others. Entrepreneurs risk failure. Artists risk instability. Immigrants risk displacement. Individuals changing life, direction, risk judgment. Abraham likely appeared foolish to many people around him. Why leave security for an invisible future? Human beings often mock uncertain journeys because they expose fears hidden inside everyone else. Abraham's movement challenges the comfort of people remaining still. Another fascinating psychological truth is that uncertainty destroys ego illusion. The ego wants mastery, predictability, control. Certainty reinforces the fantasy that human beings govern life completely. But uncertainty humbles people. It reveals dependence, fragility, limitation. Abraham repeatedly confronts this reality. He cannot force outcomes, cannot accelerate time, cannot guarantee the promise. He must live with incomplete understanding. And perhaps that is why faith becomes emotionally difficult. Because faith requires surrendering total control. Modern civilization especially resists surrender. Humanity increasingly believes every problem can eventually be solved technologically. Yet some existential realities remain. Uncertainty, suffering, mortality, meaninglessness, emotional vulnerability. Human beings still struggle internally despite external advancement. Another reason humans fear uncertainty is because modern culture trains people to expect immediacy. Instant answers, instant results, instant gratification. Social media accelerates emotional impatience further. People compare their lives constantly against curated success stories. Delayed fulfillment now feels emotionally intolerable for many individuals. Abraham's story stands completely against this mentality. He waits years, decades, without visible proof. Modern people often abandon meaningful goals because progress remains invisible temporarily. Relationships fail because discomfort appears. Discipline collapses because rewards take time. Purpose disappears beneath impatience. Abraham reveals how deeply human beings struggle with trusting processes they cannot fully see. Another painful truth is this: uncertainty creates loneliness. People walking unfamiliar paths often feel isolated because others cannot fully understand their vision. Abraham likely experienced emotional isolation repeatedly. Few people around him would have understood why he continued believing. This still happens constantly today. People pursuing meaningful but uncertain paths often feel misunderstood. Society tends to support visible success more easily than invisible perseverance. Another fascinating aspect of uncertainty is that it forces self-confrontation. Stable routines can distract people from deeper existential questions. But uncertainty strips distraction away. Human beings begin asking, who am I without security? What do I truly believe? What gives life meaning? Abraham's journey becomes existential because uncertainty forces deeper identity formation. Modern people often avoid uncertainty partly because it exposes emptiness hidden beneath routine. Constant distraction protects many individuals from confronting themselves honestly. Yet growth usually begins precisely where certainty ends. Another profound insight hidden in Abraham's story is this: uncertainty may not only produce fear, it may also create freedom. Certainty can become prison-like. Predictable lives often slowly reduce imagination. Safe routines can quietly kill possibility. Human beings sometimes cling to certainty so tightly they never discover who they might have become otherwise. Abraham's uncertainty creates transformation. Without leaving the familiar, his future never unfolds. And perhaps this reflects a universal human truth. Meaningful life often begins beyond the boundary of psychological comfort. Another deeply modern lesson here concerns anxiety itself. Modern society experiences unprecedented levels of anxiety despite unprecedented convenience. Why? Because external comfort does not eliminate existential uncertainty. People still fear failure, rejection, purposelessness, instability, death, loneliness. Technology reduced certain physical dangers while amplifying psychological comparison and overstimulation. Human beings remain internally fragile despite external advancement. Abraham's story reminds humanity that uncertainty is not abnormal. It is built into existence itself. No human being receives complete clarity about the future. Everyone walks partially blind. Some simply admit it more honestly than others. And perhaps this is the deepest philosophical insight hidden inside Abraham's journey. Certainty may never truly be available to human beings. The future always contains mystery, which means every life eventually rests upon some form of faith. Faith in relationships, faith in meaning, faith in purpose, faith in tomorrow, faith in something beyond immediate proof. Abraham simply becomes one of the clearest symbols of what it means to continue walking forward, even when certainty disappears. And maybe that is why his story still resonates thousands of years later. Because every human being eventually reaches moments where logic cannot fully remove fear, and the only path forward leads directly through the unknown. There are moments in the Bible that feel emotionally difficult. And then there is the story of Isaac on the mountain. Because this is no longer simply a story about faith. It becomes a story about the terrifying cost of faith. After decades of waiting, Abraham finally receives the promised son. Isaac, the child impossible according to logic. The child, born after years of uncertainty, disappointment, aging, and hope. Isaac was not merely Abraham's son. He represented fulfilled promise, meaning, legacy, the future itself. And then comes one of the most disturbing commands in Scripture. Take your son, your only son whom you love, and sacrifice him. Imagine hearing those words. Imagine the psychological devastation of that moment. The very thing Abraham spent his life waiting for is now the very thing he is asked to surrender. And perhaps this is why the story continues disturbing humanity thousands of years later. Because it forces confrontation with an unbearable question. How far should faith go? Human beings naturally understand sacrifice when it feels rational. Parents sacrifice for children. Soldiers sacrifice for nations. People sacrifice comfort for purpose. But Abraham's test feels different. It appears to violate logic itself, morality itself, emotion itself. Isaac is innocent. Abraham loves him deeply. And still Abraham begins climbing the mountain, slowly, silently, carrying wood for the sacrifice. Walking beside the son he believes he may lose. This silence may be one of the heaviest emotional spaces in the entire Bible. Imagine Abraham's thoughts during that journey. Fear, confusion, internal conflict, terror. Human beings often assume faith removes psychological struggle, but Abraham's story suggests the opposite. Sometimes faith intensifies struggle. Because true faith forces confrontation with uncertainty at the deepest possible level. Abraham cannot fully understand the command. Yet he continues, walking. And perhaps this is where the story becomes philosophically dangerous. Because modern readers naturally ask, was Abraham's obedience heroic? Or horrifying? This question has troubled philosophers, theologians, and psychologists for centuries. Søren Kierkegaard became obsessed with Abraham precisely because the story seems to move beyond ordinary morality. Kierkegaard called it the leap of faith, the moment where human beings step beyond rational certainty into trust that cannot be logically secured. But this creates enormous tension, because blind obedience can also become dangerous. History contains many examples of people committing terrible acts while believing they served higher causes, which means Abraham's story forces humanity into one of the most uncomfortable philosophical spaces possible: the conflict between morality, reason, and faith. Another emotionally devastating detail appears during the journey itself. Shishak asks, "Where is the lamb for the offering?" Imagine hearing your child ask that question while carrying unbearable knowledge internally. Abraham replies, "God will provide." And perhaps that sentence reveals something profound about human existence. Sometimes people continue moving forward while emotionally breaking inside. Parents do this constantly. Leaders do this constantly. Human beings often carry invisible emotional burdens while still trying to protect others around them. Abraham's silence may represent emotional survival itself. Another terrifying aspect of the story is the possibility that Isaac understood what was happening. Shishak is not portrayed as an infant, which means at some point realization may have entered his mind. The wood, the altar, the absence of sacrifice, the fear. Imagine the emotional tension between father and son in that moment. Trust colliding with terror, love colliding with obedience. Human language itself almost fails describing the psychological weight of the scene. Abraham binds Isaac, places him on the altar, raises the knife, and time itself seems to stop. Perhaps this becomes one of the deepest symbols in all religious literature. The moment where human beings confront whether they truly trust something beyond themselves completely. Yet, psychologically, the story also reveals another painful truth. Meaningful life often demands sacrifice. Not necessarily literal sacrifice, but emotional sacrifice. Sacrifice of comfort, ego, immediate gratification, old identities. Human beings want meaning without surrender, purpose without cost, growth without pain. But Abraham's story suggests transformation always requires releasing something precious. Another profound psychological layer here concerns attachment. Human beings naturally cling to what gives them meaning. Relationships, identity, achievement, security. Shishak represented all of these things for Abraham, which means the story becomes symbolic not only of obedience, but of whether human beings can surrender even their deepest attachments. Modern people struggle intensely with this. Some become emotionally dependent on careers, others on relationships, others on status, others on control itself. Human beings often fear losing externally what secretly defines them internally. Abraham confronts that fear directly. Another disturbing philosophical question emerges. Why would faith require sacrifice at all? Perhaps because sacrifice reveals what people truly worship. Human beings always organize life around highest priorities: money, success, identity, love, ideology, God. Something always sits at the center. Abraham's test exposes whether faith remains real when it becomes costly. Easy belief proves very little. Comfortable faith proves very little, but sacrifice reveals depth of commitment. This principle extends far beyond religion. Every meaningful human pursuit requires sacrifice. Great relationships require sacrifice. Great art requires sacrifice. Great leadership requires sacrifice. Great character requires sacrifice. Modern culture often avoids this truth because society increasingly worships comfort and convenience. Yet meaningful existence usually demands surrender somewhere. Another psychologically powerful aspect of this story is Abraham's emotional isolation. He cannot fully explain what he is experiencing to anyone else. Some human struggles become deeply solitary. Individuals carrying impossible responsibility often experience profound loneliness. Parents carrying fear for children, leaders making painful decisions, people navigating moral dilemmas without easy answers. Abraham's climb up the mountain becomes symbolic of existential loneliness itself. Another haunting question remains: how did this experience affect Isaac afterward? The Bible says little about Isaac's internal psychology, but modern readers naturally wonder. Did trust change? Did fear remain? Did trauma linger silently? This matters because even meaningful experiences can leave emotional scars. Human beings are not untouched by intense psychological moments. Faith does not erase emotional consequence automatically. And perhaps this is why the story feels so emotionally raw even today. Then suddenly, at the final moment, everything changes. A voice calls out, "Do not lay a hand on the boy." Abraham stops. Shishak lives. A ram appears as substitute sacrifice. The unbearable tension breaks. Relief enters the story almost violently. Yet perhaps the emotional weight never fully disappears. Abraham descended the mountain changed forever. Shishak likely did as well, because some experiences permanently reshape human identity. Another profound insight emerges here. Faith is not proven when life feels safe. Faith becomes visible when human beings continue moving despite fear, uncertainty, and emotional cost. Yet the story also warns how frightening faith can become when separated entirely from reflection and morality. This tension is exactly why Abraham remains such a psychologically complex figure. He cannot be reduced into simplistic categories: hero, villain, saint, fanatic. Abraham exists inside uncomfortable ambiguity. And perhaps that ambiguity explains why his story continues haunting humanity. Because every human being eventually faces moments requiring surrender without full understanding. Moments where certainty disappears. Moments where life demands sacrifice before meaning becomes visible. The mountain of Isaac becomes symbolic of every moment. Human beings must decide whether they trust deeply enough to continue, even when the cost feels unbearable. And perhaps the most unsettling part of all is this: Abraham's greatest test did not involve whether he believed in God. It involved whether he trusted enough to let go of what he loved most. And maybe that remains one of the hardest psychological challenges any human being can ever face. The mountain was behind them. Now, Shishak was alive. Abraham had passed the test. The knife never fell. The sacrifice was stopped. From the outside, the story appears to end in relief. But psychologically, nothing about that experience could simply disappear. Because surviving an emotional crisis does not erase its impact, some moments permanently reshape the human soul. And perhaps this is where Abraham's story becomes deeply human again. What happens after the test? What happens after a person carries unbearable emotional tension? How does the mind recover from walking up a mountain, believing you may lose the person you love most? The Bible moves forward quickly after the sacrifice of Isaac. But psychologically, modern readers cannot help asking difficult questions. How did Abraham carry that memory afterward? How did Isaac? Could life ever feel completely normal again? Human beings are shaped not only by what physically happens to them, but by what they emotionally survive. Trauma does not always come from physical harm. Sometimes trauma comes from fear, tension, helplessness, unbearable uncertainty. Abraham spent an entire journey preparing internally for unimaginable loss. The nervous system cannot simply erase that intensity instantly. Modern psychology understands this deeply. Soldiers returning from war often remain psychologically alert long after the battlefield disappears. Parents surviving medical emergencies involving children carry invisible fear afterward. Individuals surviving near-disaster experiences often replay moments repeatedly in memory. The body remembers terror, even after danger passes. Abraham may have carried the mountain inside him for the rest of his life. Another profound psychological consequence is emotional exhaustion. Abraham's entire life had already been built around uncertainty. Leaving home, wandering through unfamiliar lands, waiting decades for promises, enduring ambiguity, carrying responsibility. And now, the sacrifice of Isaac becomes the climax of lifelong tension. Human beings are not emotionally infinite. Even strong people eventually feel the weight of prolonged pressure. Modern culture often romanticizes resilience as endless strength. But real resilience usually looks different. Sometimes resilience simply means surviving while carrying invisible scars. Abraham may have appeared faithful externally while internally carrying profound emotional fatigue. Another painful question emerges around Isaac himself. What did this experience do to the son? Shishak trusted his father enough to climb the mountain, trusted him enough to follow him, and then suddenly became the sacrifice. Imagine the emotional confusion, fear, vulnerability, helplessness. Modern readers naturally wonder, did Isaac ever fully forget that moment? Trauma often reshapes relationships permanently. Trust becomes more fragile after moments of deep emotional fear. This still happens constantly today. Children raised inside unstable environments often carry anxiety into adulthood. Individuals betrayed by people they trusted struggle to feel safe again. Emotional wounds reshape perception quietly over time. The Bible does not describe Isaac's internal psychology directly, yet perhaps the silence itself feels haunting. Some emotional experiences become too deep for language. Another major psychological consequence in Abraham's story is the burden of responsibility. Leadership often carries invisible loneliness. Abraham could not fully explain his internal struggle to others. People carrying immense responsibility frequently experience emotional isolation because others cannot fully understand the weight they carry. Parents experience this. Leaders experience this. Caregivers experience this. Individuals making impossible decisions often suffer silently. Abraham's journey up the mountain becomes symbolic of this lonely burden. He must continue walking while emotionally collapsing. Internally, another difficult truth hidden in the story is this: faith does not remove psychological struggle. Many people mistakenly imagine spiritual individuals as emotionally untouchable, but Abraham's life repeatedly demonstrates fear, uncertainty, exhaustion, doubt, and internal conflict. Faith did not eliminate his humanity. If anything, it intensified his emotional burden at times. Modern people often assume meaningful lives should feel emotionally clear, but Abraham's story suggests something far more realistic. Purpose and pain often coexist. Deep meaning does not guarantee emotional ease. Another psychological consequence appears in Abraham's relationship with certainty itself. After the mountain, Abraham likely understood more deeply than ever that life cannot be controlled fully. Human beings often cling to the illusion that enough planning can protect what they love. But the sacrifice of Isaac destroys that illusion entirely. Abraham learns that even the most precious parts of life remain vulnerable. This realization can produce two opposite responses psychologically: despair, surrender. Some people become consumed by anxiety once they realize life cannot be controlled. Others slowly develop humility and acceptance. Abraham's story suggests faith may involve accepting vulnerability rather than eliminating it. Another fascinating psychological layer concerns attachment. Shishak represented Abraham's deepest emotional attachment, the promised future. Legacy. Hope. Human beings naturally organize identity around attachments. Family. Success. Relationships. Recognition. Control. But intense attachment also creates fear. The more something defines identity, the more terrifying losing it becomes. Abraham's test confronts attachment at its deepest level. And perhaps this reveals another uncomfortable truth about human existence. People often suffer not only because they lose things, but because they fear losing them constantly. Modern anxiety frequently works this way. Fear of losing status, fear of losing love, fear of losing security, fear of losing meaning. Abraham walks directly through that fear. Another consequence of profound emotional experiences is identity transformation. Human beings do not emerge unchanged from moments of extreme psychological tension. The mountain likely changed Abraham permanently, changed Isaac permanently. Some experiences divide life into before and after. Modern people understand this intuitively. Before the diagnosis, before the loss, before the betrayal, before the accident. Catastrophic or emotionally overwhelming moments reorganize identity internally. Abraham descends the mountain no longer merely as a man with faith, but as someone who has confronted the terrifying cost of faith directly. Another important psychological truth appears here. Human beings can survive experiences they never imagined survivable. This is both frightening and powerful. Throughout history, people endured war, exile, grief, collapse, uncertainty, impossible responsibility. Abraham's story becomes symbolic of the human capacity to continue carrying meaning even under immense emotional strain. Yet the story also warns against simplistic understandings of faith. Blind obedience, separated entirely from morality, becomes dangerous. History proves this repeatedly. Ideologies, extremism, fanaticism. Human beings sometimes justify terrible actions through absolute certainty, which is why Abraham's story remains morally uncomfortable. It forces readers into unresolved tension intentionally, and perhaps that tension matters, because mature faith may require humility rather than arrogance. Abraham never fully controls or fully understands everything happening around him. He walks through mystery, fear, ambiguity. Modern people often crave absolute ideological certainty because uncertainty feels emotionally painful. But absolute certainty can also become psychologically dangerous. Abraham's story exists in the difficult middle space. Trust without total understanding. Another psychological consequence hidden in Abraham's journey is generational impact. Children inherit emotional realities from parents constantly. Anxiety passes through families. Fear passes through families. Expectations pass through families. Isaac's descendants would eventually inherit the story of the mountain itself. Human experiences echo across generations long after the original moment ends. This still happens today. Trauma travels silently through family systems. Emotional wounds shape parenting. Unresolved fear shapes relationships. Human beings often pass down internal struggles unconsciously. Abraham's story reminds humanity that powerful emotional moments rarely affect only individuals alone. They ripple outward through history. Another profound lesson emerges around sacrifice itself. Meaningful life often requires surrender. Yet surrender always leaves emotional marks. Parents sacrifice dreams for children. Leaders sacrifice peace for responsibility. People pursuing purpose, sacrifice, comfort, and certainty. Human beings are shaped by what they give up for what they love. Abraham becomes symbolic of this painful truth. Another difficult reality appears after the mountain. Life continues. Human beings often expect dramatic emotional resolution after major events. but many experiences leave lingering ambiguity instead. Abraham survives the test. Shishak survives the test, yet emotional memory likely remains. Modern healing often works similarly. Healing does not always erase scars. Sometimes healing means learning how to continue living meaningfully despite scars. Another deeply modern aspect of Abraham's story is existential exhaustion. Many people today quietly carry overwhelming emotional pressure. Financial fear, uncertainty about the future, family responsibility, meaninglessness, anxiety, invisible grief. Abraham reminds humanity that even spiritually meaningful lives can feel emotionally heavy. Strength does not mean absence of struggle. Sometimes strength means continuing despite struggle. Another powerful insight hidden inside Abraham's psychological journey is this: faith transforms not by removing fear, but by teaching people how to move through fear. Abraham never becomes emotionless, never becomes perfectly certain, never becomes fully invulnerable. He remains human. And perhaps that is exactly why his story survives. Because human beings do not need stories about perfect people. They need stories about imperfect people continuing forward despite uncertainty, fear, and emotional burden. Abraham's life becomes symbolic of the psychological cost of carrying meaning through an unpredictable world. And maybe that is the deepest consequence of all. Once human beings encounter something larger than themselves, they can never fully return to being the same person they were before. Abraham's story may be thousands of years old, but psychologically it feels incredibly modern. Because modern humanity still struggles with the same fear Abraham faced: uncertainty. Human beings want guarantees, clear plans, predictable outcomes, stable futures. Yet life constantly refuses to provide complete certainty. Careers collapse unexpectedly. Relationships change. Economies shift. Health disappears suddenly. Entire lives can transform in moments. And perhaps this explains why anxiety has become one of the defining emotional conditions of modern civilization. People are overwhelmed not only by problems, but by unpredictability itself. Abraham becomes deeply relevant because his story forces humanity to confront a painful truth. Meaningful life often begins where certainty ends. One of the biggest lessons from Abraham's journey is this: humans crave certainty more than freedom. Many people remain trapped inside lives that no longer make them happy because familiarity feels emotionally safer than change. Toxic relationships, meaningless careers, empty routines, emotional numbness. Why do people stay? Because uncertainty feels terrifying. The unknown creates anxiety. Human beings often prefer familiar suffering over uncertain possibility. Abraham leaves that prison behind. He walks away from stability before knowing exactly where the journey leads. Modern people rarely realize how psychologically difficult this truly is. Every meaningful transformation requires uncertainty. First, starting a business, leaving a harmful environment, changing identity, pursuing purpose, falling in love, inventing life. None of these things come with guarantees. Yet without risk, growth rarely happens. Another important modern lesson from Abraham concerns comfort zones. Modern civilization increasingly worships comfort, convenience, immediate gratification, predictability. But comfort can slowly become spiritual paralysis. Human beings stop growing when safety becomes the highest value. They stop questioning, stop evolving, stop risking, stop pursuing meaning. Abraham's story suggests something uncomfortable. Security alone cannot satisfy the human soul. People need meaning beyond comfort. And meaning almost always demands movement into uncertainty. Another major lesson is about delayed gratification. Modern culture trains people to expect instant results, instant communication, instant pleasure. instant success. Social media intensifies this constantly. People compare themselves against curated lives and begin feeling behind emotionally. Patience becomes increasingly rare. Yet Abraham waits decades for promises to unfold, decades without visible evidence. Modern people often abandon meaningful goals too early because progress feels invisible. Relationships fail because discomfort appears. Discipline collapses because rewards take time. Dreams disappear because waiting feels unbearable. Abraham's story reminds humanity that some of the most important transformations happen slowly. Character develops slowly. Wisdom develops slowly. Trust develops slowly. Meaning develops slowly. Another deeply modern lesson involves anxiety and control. Modern society constantly pushes people toward optimization and control. Productivity systems, life planning, financial forecasting, self-improvement culture. Human beings increasingly believe they should be able to control every aspect of life perfectly. Yet this obsession often creates more anxiety instead of peace. Why? Because reality remains unpredictable no matter how advanced civilization becomes. Abraham's story teaches something psychologically profound. Peace may not come from controlling everything. Peace may come from accepting that control itself is limited. Another powerful lesson from Abraham concerns identity. Many modern people build identity entirely around external things: career, status, money, appearance, social approval. But external identity is fragile. Careers disappear. Beauty fades. Trends change. Public approval shifts constantly. Abraham repeatedly loses external stability throughout his journey. Yet his identity becomes anchored in something deeper than circumstances. Modern people often feel emotionally unstable because identity is built on unstable foundations. Abraham's story suggests meaning must come from something deeper than temporary external success. Another important lesson concerns sacrifice. Modern culture increasingly promotes the idea that life should maximize comfort while minimizing pain. But meaningful existence always requires sacrifice somewhere. Parents sacrifice freedom for children. Great relationships require sacrifice. Discipline requires sacrifice. Purpose requires sacrifice. Abraham's story confronts humanity with this uncomfortable reality directly. The sacrifice of Isaac becomes symbolic of a deeper truth. Whatever people love most will eventually test them emotionally. Another modern lesson is the danger of excessive rationalism without meaning. Modern society often believes human beings can survive on logic and material success alone. Yet many people today feel spiritually empty despite external achievement. Depression, loneliness, existential anxiety, nihilism. Why? Because human beings need more than survival. They need purpose. Abraham's story suggests faith is not merely religious belief. Faith is what allows human beings to continue moving toward meaning, despite uncertainty. Everyone places faith somewhere. In money, in progress, in love, in ideology, in success, in God. Human beings cannot live psychologically without trusting something larger than immediate proof. Another profound lesson from Abraham is that doubt does not necessarily destroy faith. Modern people often assume certainty is required for meaningful commitment, but Abraham repeatedly struggles emotionally throughout his life. Fear, confusion, waiting, internal conflict. Yet he continues moving forward anyway. This matters deeply because many people today feel ashamed of uncertainty, ashamed of questioning, ashamed of fear. But Abraham's story suggests something liberating. Courage is not the absence of fear. Faith is not the absence of doubt. Perhaps courage means continuing despite fear. Perhaps faith means continuing despite doubt. Another deeply modern aspect of Abraham's story concerns loneliness. People walking meaningful paths often feel isolated. Society supports visible success more easily than invisible perseverance. Individuals changing their lives, pursuing purpose, resisting social pressure, following unconventional paths often experience misunderstanding. Abraham walked through that loneliness constantly. Modern people experience it too, because transformation often separates individuals temporarily from familiar social structures. Another important lesson involves existential meaning itself. Modern civilization increasingly struggles with meaninglessness. People consume endless entertainment, yet feel emotionally empty afterward. Why? Because distraction cannot replace purpose. Human beings need something worth sacrificing for, something worth enduring uncertainty for. Abraham's life becomes symbolic of the human search for transcendent meaning. Without meaning, suffering feels unbearable. With meaning, human beings can endure extraordinary difficulty. Viktor Frankl, survivor of Nazi concentration camps, later wrote, "Those who have a why to live can bear almost anyhow." Abraham embodies this psychologically. His faith gives direction, even when certainty disappears. Another lesson from Abraham's story is humility. Modern culture increasingly encourages the illusion of total self-sufficiency. But Abraham's journey constantly reminds humanity of limitation. Human beings cannot fully control life, cannot fully predict the future, cannot fully eliminate suffering. Accepting limitation may actually create psychological maturity rather than weakness. And perhaps this leads to the deepest modern lesson of all. Uncertainty is not a flaw in life. It is part of life itself. No human being receives complete clarity. Everyone walks partially through mystery. Everyone places trust somewhere. Everyone builds life upon invisible assumptions about meaning, hope, and the future. Abraham simply becomes one of the clearest symbols of the human condition. A person moving forward without possessing complete certainty, yet refusing to stop searching for meaning anyway. And maybe that is why his story still matters so deeply today, because modern humanity remains trapped between two desires: the desire for absolute safety and the desire for a life meaningful enough to risk uncertainty for. Perhaps Abraham's story was never only about religion. Perhaps it was always about the human condition itself, about what it means to move through life without complete certainty. Because every human being eventually faces moments where logic alone cannot provide all the answers. Moments where the future disappears into mystery. Moments where control fails. Moments where people must decide what they truly trust. Abraham becomes symbolic of that moment. A man walking into uncertainty guided by something invisible. And perhaps that is why his story still survives thousands of years later. Because modern humanity, despite all technological progress, still fears the same thing Abraham feared: the unknown. Civilization advances. Technology expands. Information multiplies endlessly. Yet human beings remain emotionally fragile before uncertainty. People still fear failure, rejection, instability, loneliness, suffering, death. Modern society often promises the illusion that enough intelligence, enough planning, or enough technology can eliminate uncertainty completely. But life continues humbling that illusion. No human being fully controls existence. And perhaps this is why Abraham's journey feels existential rather than merely historical. He represents humanity confronting its limits directly. Abraham walks without total proof, waits without guarantees, sacrifices without full understanding. And maybe that reveals one of the deepest truths about human existence. Every life is built upon some form of faith. Even people rejecting religion still place trust somewhere. In science, in progress, in money, in love, in identity, in ideology. Human beings cannot function psychologically without believing something matters enough to continue living for. Absolute skepticism eventually destroys meaning itself, which raises a profound philosophical question. If human beings removed all faith entirely, what would remain? Perhaps only nihilism. Abraham's story suggests that faith is not merely about certainty regarding God. Faith may be the courage to continue moving, despite incomplete certainty about life itself. Another haunting aspect of Abraham's journey is the relationship between freedom and security. Human beings desperately crave safety, yet complete safety often becomes spiritual stagnation. People remain trapped inside predictable lives because uncertainty feels unbearable. But Abraham leaves comfort behind, and perhaps that is the paradox hidden in his story. Growth requires instability. Transformation requires surrender. Meaning requires risk. The unknown terrifies human beings because it destroys the illusion of control. Yet perhaps the unknown is also where life becomes fully alive. Another profound tension remains inside Abraham's story: the conflict between faith and reason. Modern culture often treats them as enemies, but Abraham's life exists in a more uncomfortable middle space. Pure rational certainty cannot answer every existential question. Science can explain mechanisms of reality, but not necessarily meaning. Logic can analyze existence, but not fully satisfy the human hunger for purpose. Human beings still ask, why am I here? What gives suffering meaning? What should I dedicate my life to? Abraham's journey suggests that some of life's deepest questions cannot be solved mathematically. They must be lived. Another powerful insight hidden in Abraham's story is this: perhaps faith is not the absence of doubt. Perhaps faith only becomes meaningful because doubt exists. A person requiring absolute certainty before acting may never truly live fully, because certainty itself is fragile. Relationships require trust. Love requires vulnerability. Purpose requires sacrifice. Hope requires uncertainty. Human beings constantly move forward without possessing complete proof about the future. Abraham simply becomes one of the clearest symbols of that reality. And perhaps the most disturbing part of his story is the sacrifice of Isaac, because it forces humanity to confront a terrifying possibility. What happens when belief demands surrender of what people love most? Yet, maybe the deeper symbolism is not about destruction. Maybe it is about attachment. Human beings often cling desperately to temporary things for identity. Success, status, security, control. Abraham's story challenges whether people can continue living meaningfully even when certainty disappears and attachments become fragile. Another existential truth appears here. Life itself is fundamentally uncertain. Human beings are born into mystery. Nobody fully understands the future. Nobody escapes vulnerability. Nobody avoids suffering completely. Yet people continue loving, continue hoping, continue building, continue believing, and perhaps that itself is a form of faith. Abraham becomes symbolic of the human willingness to walk forward despite not seeing the entire path ahead. Maybe that is why his story still resonates across generations, because every human being eventually reaches moments where certainty collapses, and the only thing remaining is the decision whether to keep walking anyway. Perhaps the real question was never whether Abraham trusted God completely. Perhaps the real question is this: what are human beings willing to trust enough to build an entire life upon?